everybody. Welcome to this chat about the history, the art that surrounds one of the key figures of Mexican identity, the Virgin of Guadalupe. I'm Benjamin Juarez. I'm the director of the UNAM, National University of Mexico Center for Mexican Studies in Boston, Massachusetts. And I would like to introduce the director of the National University of Mexico School in Canada, that is based near Quebec, and that's Dr. Alicia Meyer. She has also been recently appointed a corresponding member of the Mexican Academy of History, and she has written many wonderful articles and books around the Virgin of Guadalupe. And we also have another distinguished Mexican scholar, Dr. Ivan Escamilla, who has worked particularly on a very interesting character, an Italian nobleman who was fascinated with the idea of the Virgin of Guadalupe way back in the 18th century, and who really amassed an incredible collection of documents surrounding her story. So without further ado, Alicia, why don't you give us a little introduction?
Thank you, Benjamin. It's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. The Virgin of Guadalupe is, as you said, perhaps the most important symbol of Mexican identity. The cult is deeply rooted in the cultural life of Mexico since colonial times. And precisely the so-called Guadalupanismo is in itself an historical phenomenon, an element with which Mexico identifies and which is shared by the whole society. I must note that I have said a symbol, not necessarily a religious cult. Well, its origins can be traced back to the 16th century, but moreover, it can be seen as a product of colonial and Baroque culture. And the cult developed around a miraculous image believed to have been created by God itself. So here's a preliminary before we could speak more about this very interesting historical phenomenon, historical and religious phenomenon.
That's wonderful. Well, we can see also the relationship between Guadalupe and Tonantzin, the mother of all the gods in the Nahuatl tradition. But also, if we go back at the Spanish tradition, we will see that the first veneration of the Virgin in the Christendom actually happened in what is now Spain in the year 40 of the Christian era, when supposedly the Virgin appeared to Santiago Apostol in what is now the Church of Pilar. So there's a great tradition of not only venerating one God that judges and that punishes us, but of a mother, of a virgin, of a female figure that we find in many religions, and that has drawn quite a bit of attention from scholars. I would like to see what is your point of view there, Ivan.
Yeah, of course. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure being here today. You could say that in the veneration of the Virgin of Guadalupe, you have two strong cultural traditions that came together in the New World. Because, as you just said, there's this deeply rooted Middle American tradition from the Indian civilizations of central Mexico. The place where now stands the sanctuary of the Virgin of Guadalupe has been a sacred place for probably more than 1,000 years, because we know, because of archaeological excavations, that female divine figures, goddesses of earth, were worshipped at what is known as the mountains of the Sierra de Guadalupe, those mountains which are north of Mexico City. It's a series of mountains where in ancient times, temples devoted to these female figures were places where they were worshipped for centuries. And on one side, we have this ancient American tradition, and on the other, the Hispanic tradition of veneration of the Mother of God, of the Virgin Mary. And specifically, the name of Guadalupe, we should notice that is shared by by two images. Well, maybe there are two or three with the same name, but mainly these two images: the Mexican image that is widely known in the Catholic world, and also a Spanish image, the Virgin of Guadalupe of Extremadura, which is also an ancient sanctuary with a very similar story to that of the Virgin of Guadalupe of Mexico, because it is a figure of Virgin Mary, thought or believed to be made in heaven, which supposedly appeared to a humble shepherd in the mountains of Extremadura and demanded that a temple should be raised for her to be worshipped by all the people and then for the needs of everybody. So we have these two very similar stories, and also the shepherd was named Juan, like Juan Diego, the Indian visionary that was witness to the apparitions of the Virgin of Guadalupe. So we have these two strong traditions that came together. So that is very important that we should notice that when studying the story of the Virgin of the Virgin of Guadalupe.
And Juan is also John, the name of the apostle and the evangelist who wrote the book of the Apocalypse. And we can see also a similarity between the Virgin of the Apocalypse, right, standing on a moon with the angel guarding her and conquering the devil, the dragon, the snake. Alicia, you have researched a lot the messages written in religious writings across the centuries. What is the similarity between the Virgin of the End of Times, the Virgin of the Apocalypse, and the Virgin of Guadalupe?
Thank you, Benjamin. Yes. Actually, before answering your question, I would like to have a brief narrative of what the apparition is of the Virgin of Guadalupe. I think it will be okay to inform actually what the story is. And I think that is a very well constructed and beautiful account, and it is worthwhile to be known. It says that in the month of December 1531, an Indian named Juan Diego was on his way to receive the Christian doctrine in a nearby town of Mexico City. In the Mount of Tepeyac, the Virgin Mary appeared to him it says, in a celestial wardrobe surrounded by sunlight. So that is what you say, that is very similar or identical to the Apocalypse image of the Virgin Mary. Well, in a kind, motherly manner, she ordered him to stand in the presence of the Archbishop and tell him her wishes, that he built a temple in her honor in that place. And Juan Diego, incredulous and believing that he was dreaming, he naively ignored her command, and next day the Virgin appeared to him again, and did so 3 more times in the following days. On the 12th of December, to provide a proof, she asked Juan Diego to pick flowers in the surroundings and bring them to her. The field was then covered with beautiful, magnificent roses, which were very rare in the month of December. Juan Diego was able to gather a bunch of those roses and put them on his rough clock, or tilma, as it says in Spanish. And after that, he went away towards the Archbishop's dwellings and insisted the guardians that he carried a message to the prelate, and finally succeeded to meet with him. And in his presence, he unwrapped his cloak, and instead of the roses, the image of the Virgin was beautifully drawn. So following the lady's own wishes, the image was named Guadalupe and was put in a small shrine in Tepeyac. So here you can see the miracle as is described by many historiographers of the 17th and so on centuries. So it is true that there are lots of symbols in historiography since the 17th century, But I think it all started in the 16th century, around 1556, when Antonio Valeriano, an Indian teacher of Latin from Tlatelolco, was, if not the certain author of the oldest account of the apparitions of Guadalupe, which is known as Nican Mopowa, he certainly gathered many traditions, oral and written traditions, and gave them a corpus, a body. In the 17th century, with a language very rich in imagery and historical biblical exegesis and allegory and symbolism, the cult was promoted by several authors. So there were many historians in Mexico that began to speak about the miracle of Tepeyac from many points of view, where we can see many messages hidden in the symbols that surround her. Because as Ivan has noted in many of his articles, and also Jaime Cuadriello, another very renowned author, the image itself, it's a hieroglyph. It's full of meaning. So I don't know if Ivan wants to complete my idea, because I don't want to be the one that talks too much.
And I want to ask something to Ivan also. I mean, you talked about an Indian who taught Latin in Tlatelolco. Ivan, can you tell us, I mean,
yes, of
can an
course.
Indian teach Latin?
Yes, of course, because we should remember that after the Spaniards' conquest, what is today Mexico, one of their main goals was to preach Christianity to the Indians. Franciscan missionaries considered that an intelligent manner of preaching Christianity would be to teach not only the Christian doctrine, but also the European culture to the children of the Indian lords of ancient Mexico, because they considered that if the future heirs of Indian lordships became Christians, their subjects would certainly follow. So they chose a short number of the most gifted children, Indian children, and taught them Christian doctrine, Latin. Some of them learned Greek and became humanists. So they were very learned people that became natural leaders of the Indian population of central Mexico. Antonio Valeriano was one of those learned Indians, and he certainly served in different political offices in the government of the Indian peoples of Mexico under Spanish rule. So many historians have believed that he could possibly be involved in the creation of the story of the legend of the apparitions of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is the basis for what everyone else has spoke and written about the Virgin, because this story is believed by some to have been written in the 16th century, probably by Valeriano. Miguel León Portilla, our late colleague, precisely thought that it was that the Nican Mopowa, which Alicia previously mentioned, the story in Nahuatl of the apparitions of the Virgin, was full of metaphors that León Portilla believed came from the Nahuatl tradition, the Nahuatl spiritual tradition. So he was a strong advocate in the hypothesis that the Nican Mopowa was written by a learned Indian, probably like Antonio Valeriano, but this has not been proved without doubt. On the other hand, there have been some scholars who believe that the text of the Nican Mopowa was probably written by a Spanish priest, which was very fluent in Nahuatl. It's a great mystery, and we're far from solving it, by the way.
Yeah, I remember in several lectures, of course, Maestro León Portilla and other people who are fluent in Nahuatl speaking at length on the beauty of this text. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the Indian noblemen learned Greek, Latin, but also learned music and learned polyphony.
Yes.
And we have a whole another rich repertoire of music that was performed outside, inside, religious, the mitins, the traditional dances of the concheros or danzantes, as they used to be called in my time. But this brings to my attention that this Virgin had Spanish and Indian followers. And can we see her also as a mixture of bringing together these two people that until very recently had been fighting one another, and in the time of castas, where everybody was sort of labeled and put aside, to bring them everybody together into belonging to a new kind of identity.
Yes, I think that what made so strong the cult of Guadalupe was that, well, until the mid-17th century, it was mainly a devotion for the Indian people surrounding Tepeyac. That's something we should notice, that it was mainly a devotion for the people, because in the 16th century, the sanctuary had been important, and as a matter of fact, the viceroys of New Spain, the Spanish rulers of New Spain, before entering Mexico City, they always stopped at the sanctuary of Guadalupe. And it was a manner of recognizing the importance of this sanctuary and this image of the Virgin. But in the end, it was not as important, because one very important reason: it was not the only sanctuary of Virgin Mary in Mexico City. Spanish and Creole historians in the 17th and 18th century spoke about the four fortresses that surrounded Mexico City, which were four sanctuaries of different images of Virgin Mary. No? At the north, it was the sanctuary of Guadalupe. At the south, it was a sanctuary of La Piedad, which is the image of the Virgin carrying her dead son in her arms. At the east, the Virgin of La Bala, of the bullet, because an image of the Virgin that had been hit by a bullet and thus saved miraculously one of her devotees. And on the west, the Virgin of Remedios, which was an image brought by the Spanish conquistadors. So Guadalupe was not alone in the worship of the citizens of Mexico City, but it was in the 17th century that precisely preachings of different Spanish and Creole priests started to bring together the Indians and the Creoles and all other groups of the population to the veneration of the Virgin. They use metaphors, as Alicia has said, metaphors, rich imagery, tried to picture an image of the Virgin which was open to receive everyone because of her appearance and because of the story of her origin. No? So this is something very important, because the different preachers in the 17th and 18th century made a great work about it. But Alicia knows very much about this.
I think nobody knows more than Ivan, but I'll take the compliment and thank you. Well, just to add something to what Ivan and Benjamin has said, the cult of the Virgin Mary was first promoted by the conquistadores and missionary friars. The later built a humble shrine in the place where the indigenous population originally adored the Mother Earth or fertility, the fertility goddess Tonanzi, and put inside its presence an image of Mary to be admired and revered. Soon it became an important site of pilgrimage. And by the end of the 17th century, it was one of the principal avocations of the Virgin Mary in Mexico City, as Ivan has said, among the other avocations that he has mentioned. But of these authors of the 17th century, indeed, it was Miguel Sanchez, a Creole preacher, who was the first promoter, a very, very strong promoter of the Virgin of Guadalupe's cult. He was a Creole preacher, And he wrote a very influential book called Imagen de la Virgen María, Madre de Dios de Guadalupe, in 1648, which was, I think, a watershed in the promotion of the cult. And later, Ivan has also mentioned Luis Lasso de la Vega, who published the work in Nahuatl in 1649. And as Ivan said, we're not sure if Antonio Valeriano or Lasso or both enriched the tradition in Nahuatl, which brings to our attention this other element of the indigenous presence in the cult of Guadalupe. And there are others like Luis Becerra Tanco, Francisco de Florencia. They're all named as the Evangelistas of Guadalupe, the Evangelists of Guadalupe. And later, also the famous polymath Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora wrote profusely about the Virgin of Guadalupe, his Primavera Indiana of 1662, his Glorias de Querétaro, which is a breathtaking description of the new temple dedicated to the Virgin of Guadalupe, his Triunfo Parténico of 1683, an account of the festivities prepared with both religious and civil pomp, etc. So there are many authors. Boturini will come later in the 18th century, but there are also these authors that who we owe really about the history of how the history is being built surrounding the cult of Guadalupe.
So we can see that it starts as a local devotion, like the local saint, Fiesta del Santo, and then it becomes the predominant figure in the city and beyond. But you mentioned Boturini, and that really underlines the international projection of the followers of Virgin of Guadalupe. And of course, Ivan is one of the top experts on this incredible character. I think that if Boturini had not existed, someone should have written a novel about his life and his adventures. Why do you tell us more, Ivan?
Yes, of course. As Alicia just said, the different versions of the story of the Virgin, enrichment of this story was a long process that went along the 17th and 18th centuries. In the 18th century, something really important happened to the devotion of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And by the way, it is related to what is happening to us in the present. There was this great epidemic in Mexico City. As a matter of fact, in all of the present Mexican territory, the Kingdom of New Spain, as was known then, there was this terrible epidemic. Thousands of people died of a disease called by its Nahuatl name as Matlazahuatl. Thousands of people were dying in Mexico City, and in a desperate attempt to request for help from heaven, the city council of Mexico City and the cathedral chapter together asked for the people of the city to swear the Virgin of Guadalupe as the protector and patron of Mexico City. That happened in 1737. In the month of April, this is about to be 283 years ago, in the month of April of 1737. So the people of Mexico City adopted definitely the Virgin of Guadalupe as their patron. And at the same time, an Italian traveler had just arrived to New Spain, a man who called himself Lorenzo Boturini, and I should underline who called himself Lorenzo Boturini, because probably it was not his real name. This was a very peculiar character, and what we could call an adventurer, because he came from a very humble town in northern Italy, but as years went by, he started fashioning himself a new identity and started roaming different royal courts of Europe, presenting himself as a nobleman, as a man of learning, and trying to get different posts as a teacher for royal princes and so on. but he failed to do it. And somehow we still don't know how he managed to take a boat and travel to New Spain and went to Mexico City. He went to the sanctuary of the Virgin of Guadalupe and he fell in love with the image of the Virgin. And something very interesting happened then, because he asked, what was the origin of that image? And he said, well, there is a tradition that has passed from generation to generation, that it appeared to a humble Indian, the story that Alicia just told us. And when he asked, where are the documents, the proof, the story of this tradition? They said, there are none. They have been lost. So Boturini was surprised and amazed, and he said, I'm going to find those documents and I'm going to give proof that this really happened. These are historical facts and not just a legend. So for the next 7 years, he traveled through the Kingdom of New Spain, looking for those written proof of the apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And in the process, he amassed an enormous collection of Indian manuscripts, what we call codices, historical documents that he thought would serve to write this story. So in the process of becoming a historian of the Virgin of Guadalupe, he also became one of the most important historians of ancient Mexico. So he probably could have carried on with this endeavor he had adopted, but then a new viceroy arrived to Mexico City and he learned about this strange Italian character. And when he asked, why is he here? Does he have a permission to stay in New Spain? He learned then that Boturini had no permission, so he had him arrested. And all his collection of historical manuscripts was confiscated, and Boturini was expelled from New Spain to Spain. A very interesting story, because in the process of investigating who this foreigner was, it was discovered that he had invented all of this identity for himself, that he was not the person he has said he was. But well, that's part of the story of this interesting character. He's still very important anyway for the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe, because many of the documents he found in his travels have now served historians to reconstruct the original surroundings of the devotion of the Virgin of Guadalupe.
Thank you, Ivan. That was very, very interesting. And well, we can see that the following of notable leaders in the Mexican world include, of course, the heroes of the Independence War, like Father Miguel Hidalgo, whose battle flag was an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and also Jose Maria Morelos, who wrote a text where he acknowledged her as the Virgin that would protect Mexico, and everybody should celebrate her feast on December 12th. And even almost a century later, Zapata and many of his followers also had images of the Virgin. Even right now, in the middle of at the very beginning of the COVID-19, we saw in the second largest Mexican city in the world, which is not Guadalajara or Monterrey, it is Los Angeles, the Archbishop of Los Angeles asking the people of his city to pray to the Virgin of Guadalupe. What about a little view about these figures, religious or secular, in the 19th century and beyond, Alicia, using the Virgin of Guadalupe to bring people together and to ask for special favors?
Yes, the Virgin of Guadalupe has been considered an intercessor, a co-redemptor, a mediator since the 16th century. Well, the end of the 16th century, no? And she also is considered, she also blends religion and patriotism. That's why we see that in every century, we see her as a symbol or a standard. Over time, I could say that over 300 years, to be precise, during the time of Spanish dominion, and with the strong promotion of the Catholic Church and later of the Creole intellectuals, which we have mentioned, the cult developed and gained popularity till it became the most important and prominent and widespread religious icon in Mexico, and later a very outstanding one in Spain and Latin America. But we can see that since the colonial period, she has been present in theater, in literature, in art, in poetry, in theology, and religious homilies, of course. And it's very interesting, in the fight for independence, of course, she was, as Benjamin has said, a flag for the insurgents versus the realistic, the realist army who handled La Virgen de los Remedios as their banner. So this is a very interesting controversy between the two virgins as enemies. Of course, that's not the way it works, but that's how it was viewed in the 19th century at the beginning of the independence, and that's very very interesting.
May I say that well, the 19th century is very important for the development of the devotion of the Virgin of Guadalupe, because when the new Mexican nation was born in 1821, when Mexican independence was achieved finally from Spain, one of the few things that all Mexicans agreed about was that they were all devotees of the Virgin of Guadalupe. They were sharply divided in their political views about the project of the nation they wanted to build. But one thing was sure, that they were all followers of the Virgin of Guadalupe. As a matter of fact, the Virgin had been sworn as the national protector of New Spain since the 18th century. So it was one thing that the new Mexican nation inherited from its colonial past. But then in the 19th century, Mexicans fought each other in terrible civil wars, like the Guerra de Reforma in the mid-19th century. And the nation went through a very painful process where state and church were separated. The liberal party that won those civil conflicts started building a political nation based on liberal principles that put religion as a private part of the lives of people. But on the other hand, the Mexican people continued to be profoundly Catholic. So what happened in the last years of the 19th century? The Catholic clergy, the main archbishops and bishops of the Mexican Catholic Church, decided that it was necessary that the Mexican nation continued to build its identity on the Catholic tradition, on its Catholic roots. So what they thought was a very smart move in political and cultural terms, we could say, because it was the age when railroads started creating bonds through all the Mexican territory. So Mexicans could easily travel from the borders of the Mexican territory to Mexico City to visit the sanctuary of the Virgin of Guadalupe. So they started asking people to come in pilgrimage from the farthest corners of the country to visit the sanctuary. So the famous pilgrimages to the sanctuary of Guadalupe, which today are very famous, where we can see millions of people visiting the sanctuary of Guadalupe every December 12th, started, as a matter of fact, in the late 19th century, when modern means of transportation made it possible for people to travel and visit the sanctuary of the Virgin. So in the end, it was a very successful endeavor by the Catholic Church to also build a Catholic identity for the nation centered around the cult of the Virgin of Guadalupe. That's something that when you visit the old Basilica of Guadalupe, you can see these enormous mural paintings made in the late 19th century, when the story of the nation is told from the perspective, you could say, of the Virgin of Guadalupe. So that is something that's present in the identity of millions of Mexicans. Even those who are not Catholic have to recognize that this symbol is very powerful and that it is recognizable for many people inside and outside Mexico, of course. For all the descendants of Mexicans outside the Mexican borders in the United States and many other parts of the world, it's a symbol that is instantly recognized. So that's part of an interesting process that started in the 19th century, as a matter of fact.